Welcome to the studio.
Oh, thank you for having me.
They say that there's an agreement, a deal in the offing with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol. What might that deal look like? When will it happen? And will it be satisfactory?
Well, those are very good questions. The key is that the European Court of Justice is not involved in deciding what goes on in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It is no longer an outpost of the European Empire, and therefore it would be quite wrong for it to continue to be subject to control by the European Court of Justice. That is fundamental. It is part of the United Kingdom, and therefore the flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland should be free. And there is a bill passing through Parliament that does that. So if there is no agreement, then that bill can complete its passage, and we can do it anyway. We are, as you pointed out earlier, a sovereign nation.
Indeed, although given our current challenging economic circumstances, if we were to unilaterally remove, activate Article 16 and cancel the protocol, there would be a trade war, and that would cost the country dearly, wouldn't it?
Well, we're the EU's biggest trading partner. We have a very large deficit with the European Union. So the cost to the European Union of not trading with the UK would be very significant too. Trade wars don't help anybody. I'm very against trade wars. I don't think we should indulge in one. If the EU decided to have one under the TCA, it has to be proportionate to the offence that they feel has taken place. They couldn't, under the agreement they've made, I mean, they could break their agreements, which they have in the past, but assume they stick to the agreement they made. They couldn't have a generalised trade war on changes to Northern Ireland.
Do you think that the EU will budge on the ECJ?
Well, I think the ECJ has no right to interfere in the affairs of a sovereign nation that is not part of the European Union.
No, but they've been happy to do that hitherto, haven't they?
Of course they have. But that, I think, is a red line for politicians in Northern Ireland, and if we want the Northern Ireland Assembly to reconvene fully. But it should be a red line for British politicians. We can't allow part of our country to remain under the suzerainty of the European Union.
Is it a red line for Rishi Sunak, do you think?
I would assume so. I mean, he's been pretty clear that he is committed to dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol properly.
What's your overview now about Brexit and how it's going?
Well, the fundamental thing is that we now determine our own government. And that is so important. And then we can make choices. And we can make choices based on the democratic will of the British people. And I think that is fundamental to our future prosperity. And some of it's going to be in big things. So there is the potential of dealing with Solvency II, which could be worth, I think, £65 billion of extra investment a year. It's a really big thing. The Bank of England's dragging its feet, but leave that to one side. That's a big thing. But there are lots of little things that are happening. So we had a bill passing through Parliament, for the House of Commons recently, on gene editing, which is going to be an improvement in agricultural processes for the UK that the EU won't have. We've got the retained EU law bill. There are 2,500, near enough, pieces of EU legislation that we will be able to change and have our own rules for. And that's a great opportunity to free up our markets, make the UK more efficient, and take the dead hand of costly regulation off business.
Well, I speak as somebody that voted Remain, that I accepted the result, and now that we've got Brexit, it's clear that it's an insurance policy against ever being in the euro, which would be a disaster for our economy. It's an insurance policy against a single European army. We've seen how impotent the EU and Brussels have been in regard to Ukraine and how slow to act, unlike Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. It's an insurance policy against ever closer union, being part of the United States of Europe. Potential COVID tyranny. We know that the EU is drawing up a treaty which would allow for future pandemics and mask mandates and vaccine mandates, all the rest of it. We're free of all of that. So I understand that. But what would you say to those watching, small business owners who are struggling because of Brexit? We can't deny the short-term impacts, can we?
Well, let's go back to one of the things you said, because I think that's fundamentally important on Ukraine. I think had we been a member of the European Union in February of this year, under the doctrine of sincere cooperation, we would not actually have been able to do what we did to arm Ukraine, to help Ukraine, and to set a framework that has allowed Ukraine to be so successful. And that would have been one of the biggest defeats for the Western world, for Western values, in modern history. So that is a really important consequence of not being in the European Union, not being subject to sincere cooperation, which is an important rule of foreign policy, which is determined by unanimity but subject to this.
So Brexit has actually helped Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky to fight Russia?
Fundamentally, yes. I think this is of great importance and much under-commented on, actually. I think it's allowed British foreign policy, led by Boris Johnson, to work through policies that have helped Ukraine fundamentally. But to come to your question on small businesses, the issue here is on the small businesses that trade with the European Union. And yes, the EU has put extra checks on goods going from the UK into the EU. And it's done this because it's cross that we have left the European Union. It's not particularly in the spirit of the agreement we came to with them. And we quite rightly haven't retaliated. So goods coming from the EU into the UK are still pretty freely distributed and received. And that keeps input costs down and keeps consumer costs lower, because actually free trade is always good for the country that gives it. And we should give more free trade. We should make our market more open, so not just to Europe, but to the rest of the world, which is what we're doing with free trade agreements.
And what about Rishi Sunak? Now, you've described him in the past as a bad chancellor. Will he be a better Prime Minister?
Well, I'm going to support Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister because the Conservative Party needs to unite around somebody. The Conservative Party has done itself no favours by defenestrating one Prime Minister after another. This has done us a lot of harm, and it's not been good for the country either. We need clear, united government, so I will support him and let bygones be bygones.
What are your thoughts about rumoured tax rises in the latest budget statement on Thursday? Austerity 2.0 and tax rises for everyone. Is that the way to go?
No. I was reading on the way here a very interesting report by the IMF in 2018 on how economies had succeeded in the first round of austerity and which economies had done best in coming out of it. And the ones that had done best in coming out of it were the ones that had reduced expenditure but not increased taxation. And this is really interesting and important because of the long-term effects increasing taxation has on economic growth. And the key thing in the ABR forecast, the key variable, will be what their growth forecast is. If you can get growth a little bit higher, then debt to GDP begins to come down. And that must be the overall objective. If you put taxes up, you risk stalling the economy, so debt to GDP actually goes up. It risks making things worse rather than better. So I would encourage considerable caution about tax rises, and I hope that so far what we've heard has been kite flying to try and frighten the horses a bit, so that when it's announced, everyone heaves a sigh of relief and says, oh, well, thank heavens, it's only a bit of fiscal drag rather than all the great terrors that are being put forward in newspapers at the moment.
And although the IMF were critical of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's ill-fated mini-budget, they had to concede days after all of the U-turns that Britain would have a deeper recession in its absence. So do you think that's true too? Do you think that the failure of that first budget to be seen through will cause Britain to have a longer and deeper recession?
I think it was a pity that other things weren't put in place at the same time.
OBR?
There's a wonderful piece in the Telegraph in the last couple of days pointing out quite how wrong the ABR forecasts have been. The ABR is no better or worse than other forecasters, but forecasting is not a precise science, and it depends so much on the information you put into your model. That's what I was saying about GDP growth. If you vary GDP growth slightly, all the other figures change. Your deficit changes, your debt to GDP changes, and so you're trying to get to an authoritative figure from a whole series of speculations. And that inevitably is not going to get you to an authoritative figure. So I want to be careful about mistaking the ABR for Holy Writ.
Now that you're a free man, you're a sovereign politician, can you see yourself voting against this government anytime soon?
No, I intend to support this government in the division lobby, that the government has my confidence. Now, that's not to say there mayn't be some amendment to a bill there where I'm broadly supporting the bill, where I think X would be slightly better than Y. That's the routine of parliamentary activity. But on anything that relates to confidence in the government, of which the budget's pretty fundamental, I would expect to support the government.
I interviewed you on my radio show early in the pandemic about lockdowns. Of course, we saw these government measures, and I said to you at the time that you're a very principled man, you're a libertarian at heart, and I can't imagine that you'll have been much of a cheerleader for these lockdowns. Well, it emerged an exclusive in the Mail on Sunday newspaper in late January of this year that a holy triumvirate of yourself, Lord Frost, and Rishi Sunak, according to the Mail on Sunday, essentially saved Christmas at the end of last year, confronted the Prime Minister and said, don't give in to those prophets of doom at Sage. Did you save Christmas last year?
I don't think it's quite how I remember it, though it fairly reflects my view, because Boris Johnson had exactly the same view. So it wasn't a challenge to him. I think we're now...
So we can add him to that list.
We can add him to that list. He actually, Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, rang me on a Sunday evening when I was driving back from Somerset, before we had the discussion about whether we would close for Christmas, and encouraged me to express my views clearly. I didn't need a lot of encouragement, but Boris Johnson, in my view, was very clearly, throughout, always wanting to keep things as open as possible, and gave in to the professional advice, which was always extraordinarily cautious, and understandably so.
Although you'll be perturbed as a numbers man, having made your money in the city, at the consistent inaccuracy of modelling for the disease, which dictated government policy. If we had our time again, would you have pushed back on some of those lockdowns? I've got you down as a lockdown sceptic. Are you?
I thought the first lockdown was perfectly reasonable before we knew anything. I was making the case privately for less in the way of lockdown once we had got through the first period. Yes, I was a lockdown sceptic. I had a lot of sympathy with what a number of MPs were saying in the House of Commons. But you make absolutely the right point. You have raised the question about modelling. What are we about to do now? We are about to have an economic policy entirely dependent on modelling. Why do we think an economic model is going to be any more accurate than a model of a pandemic? The truth is it's not. Modelling is an educated guess. It is not fact. And therefore you've got to apply judgment to it. And I think the mistake that we made early on in the pandemic, and almost everybody made, was to think that the models were fact rather than something to which you then needed to apply your judgment, and to think, is it reasonable not to allow people to accompany each other to funerals? And some of the restrictions we put in hindsight, were appalling and should never, ever happen again. And we must learn from that. And I hope the inquiry will look at things that were fundamentally unreasonable.
Was Boris Johnson a good Prime Minister?
Oh, Boris was an excellent Prime Minister. I think in terms of the pandemic, he got the big decisions right. I think it would have been extraordinarily difficult to have avoided lockdown. And then he got us out of it earlier than any other country, and he ordered the vaccine in enormous quantities, faster than other countries. He really pushed on with that. He delivered Brexit. And as you said in your introduction, he agreed to the Northern Ireland Protocol to get Brexit done. It needed to be done. It is now the law of the land. So no, I think Boris was a very good Prime Minister. And if you take Ukraine, I think we will look back on that in decades to come as one of the most important foreign policy decisions a British government has taken in the post-war period.
Do you anticipate his eventual return?
Well, I was encouraging his return just a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was a mistake to get rid of him in July. I thought it would have been marvellous to have brought him back in late October or early November, whenever precisely it was. Yeah. He is a very interesting figure that it's very rare to have his type of charisma. It's something political parties are lucky to get once in a generation. Many of your viewers won't like this, but Tony Blair probably had it, and Margaret Thatcher had it, an extraordinary visceral connection with the electorate. And Boris has that in spades. People stop their cars to get out to see him. He connects with people in a way that other politicians don't succeed in doing.
A very clever man as well, but did he have the coherence, the discipline to be a great Prime Minister?
Oh, yes.
He's a very ordered personality, is he? He's chaotic.
But what are you looking for in a Prime Minister? Are you looking for an arch bureaucrat, somebody who puts everything in order and after 35 hours says, well, now it's time to go home? Or are you looking for somebody who gets the big calls right, who gets the big ideas right? Margaret Thatcher was very unusual because she was both. She both had the big idea and the detailed analysis. But I wouldn't say Churchill was particularly ordered or structured in his approach to government. I'm not sure Disraeli was. And we could go through lots of prime ministers. One of my favourite activities to work through them. But throughout our history, some of the great leaders are people who have the oomph and the vision to see what the big idea is and push that through, rather than being effective bean counters.
Are you the Prime Minister that got away?
Me? No. I was very keen to support Boris. So I didn't.
You're still young. Never say never.
Well, I'm not that young, actually. My children keep on pointing out at me. I'm getting on a bit now. I used to tell them that the reason my hair was the colour it's now going was because shaving foam had got stuck in it. I'm afraid none of my children any longer believe that.
Well, I think you're pretty sprightly. I haven't checked your age, but I think there's a lot more left in terms of your career. What would you like to do next? I mean, I think you'd make a great broadcaster as well as politician. Would you come and work for GBNews?
That's very kind and very flattering. I think politics is about getting across the ideas that you think are important and doing that in as many ways as is possible. Being back on the backbenches is very liberating because before coming on to see you, I didn't have the chip put in to tell me what the line to take was. I am free to say what I think is interesting. And the battle of ideas is fundamental to politics, and there are various ways of doing that. But being a member of Parliament is a fundamentally important way of doing that, partly because it gives you the platform to represent views that you wish to put across, but also you have a closeness to voters because you represent them as a constituency MP, and they keep you so well informed about what is going on, what the effect of policy is. So it's both an honour to represent people, but it's also an amazing education.
Although, arguably, you're wasted on the backbenches. I think it was when you were business secretary, you said this department is going to be the department for economic growth. That's what we need at the moment from this government, isn't it? A relentless focus on growth, which sadly went the way of Liz Truss.
Oh, I don't know. I think Grant Shapps will be a very good advocate for growth as the business secretary. I don't think it needed me to do it, but of course we need to concentrate on economic growth.
Have the Tory wets taken over the party now? Lots of my viewers feel that the Conservative Party is not conservative enough. They look at someone like you and they say that's a Conservative, not the current incumbent at number 10.
OK, well, the challenge for people like me, the challenge for your viewers, is that we've got to win the argument. And unfortunately, with the mini-budget, whether for the short term or for a medium term, we lost the argument. It'd be pretty silly to pretend otherwise. It's like all those socialists who go on and say, if only we'd been a bit more socialist. And it's never true. What we need to recognise is that we tried to get across Conservative policies. We hadn't got our ducks in a row. Things didn't work. We have to learn from that and articulate the policies that as a package will work. That's the real challenge, rather than simply saying the people who are now in charge aren't Conservative, because they've all stood on a Conservative manifesto.
Just a couple of minutes to go, and thank you for giving up a chunk of your Sunday evening. The kids are probably in bed now, fast asleep.
Certainly the younger ones are.
I
wouldn't swear to the elder ones.
You've got a lovely family, congratulations.
Thank you.
And very, very happy kids, and with a famous dad. There have been occasions when you and your family have been harassed on the street, on your property, which is absolutely reprehensible. I watched those scenes. They were unedifying and wrong. Does it hurt you when that kind of thing happens?
No, I chose to go into public life. And I have never had any threat of physical violence. It is a free country. People are allowed to protest. I've always been very relaxed about that. And I think the right to protest peacefully, I don't include shutting the motorways in that, I think that's in a different category, is really fundamentally important. Freedom of speech is one of the things that makes our constitution work. And if that means I'm occasionally shouted at, that is a very small price to pay. And when I got walked home by the police from Parliament on one occasion with my eldest son, and people were so nice to me, they said, oh, your poor son, how horrid for him, and so on and so forth. And I spoke to him, and he said, Daddy, can we have a police escort every time we walk home? So children are quite robust.
Well, that's it's good of you to be so sanguine, and you are consistent in being a free speech advocate, and I completely understand that. And then just briefly, a couple of other things. First of all, I think you're the most sartorially elegant member of the House. So where do you buy your suits? Are they tailor-made? Is it Savile Row?
I'm not the most sartorially elegant. I'm the most sartorially consistent. I basically have a number of suits all exactly the same.
Any idea how many suits you've got?
No.
There'll be a few.
There'll be a few, but they are all identical.
Right. And do you ever dress down? Have you ever worn shorts?
Oh, not since. As a child, I was forced to. I always hated wearing shorts as a child. I've never worn them in adulthood.
Oh, and I'm sure you're hiding an excellent pair of pins. Your friend and former colleague Matt Hancock's in the jungle. Was that a mistake to go onto that show?
Yes, it was, and he was ill-advised to do it. But there is an important but. There's a very important article in the Sunday Times today. I think the treatment he is getting has gone beyond good fun and become deeply unpleasant. And it rather worries me that people think it is funny to humiliate somebody in this way. I think it is a regrettable side of our culture. And I think it's gone from being Matt Hancock's gone into the jungle, let's tease him a bit, to something really rather unpleasant. I'm not at all comfortable with what is being reported as to the way he's being treated. I can't say I've ever watched the programme, but I've certainly read the newspapers about it, and I think it's just gone too far and has become unpleasant.
Final question, million-dollar question. The date of the next general election, and what is the percentage chance of a Tory victory?
I think it will go late, and the last date is January 2025. I doubt it'll be quite as late as that, but I expect it to go late. And I think participants in elections are advised to say anything other than the routine that they expect a fantastic Tory victory. It's not our job to forecast the result.
My best wishes to the family.
You are kind.
Enjoy your newfound freedom.
Thank you very much.
And look forward to seeing you again in the studio, I hope. Jacob Rees-Mogg, MP.